Welcome to the Zoom Wednesday night Bible study, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Tonight is lesson 4 of an interim Bible study I'm calling Pivotal Passages. If I could only teach or preach one chapter of a biblical book, what would it be and why? What passage or verses in a biblical book is pivotal to its overall themes? The aim is to identify a passage or a handful of verses that help in understanding the entirety of a particular biblical book it comes from, and how the verses or the passage or the book fits into the larger story of the entire Christian Bible. Now, any study of pivotal passages is subjective. Your choice of a pivotal passage is just as valid as mine. And don't worry, the Bible study will not be 66 weeks, but we might return to the study at other interims in the future. In the first lesson, I chose Genesis 12 for Genesis. In the second lesson, I chose passages from Exodus 25 and 29. And last week, we got through Leviticus as I chose verses from Leviticus chapter 11 and chapter 22. We discussed the definition of holiness and why it played a pivotal role in the story of Israel's journey in the wilderness. And we also took a look at Jesus's favorite chapter of Leviticus and its implications for us today. Tonight, we look at the book of Numbers. Now, the Hebrew title for Numbers actually means in the wilderness because most of the book is about Israel's wanderings in the wilderness. But the book ends up being called Numbers because of the the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible known as the Septuagint. The Septuagint titled it Numbers because of the two census readings. The first census is recorded in Numbers 1 and the second in Numbers 26. So Numbers it is, and believe me, there's a lot of counting that goes on in the book. Now, before I get to the pivotal passage, let me share briefly about how the book of Numbers is constructed. And I share this because sometimes knowing where we are in a biblical book will help us in understanding the passage that we're studying. Now, there are two ways in general that people outline the book of Numbers. And the outline that I'm going to use is a geographical one. And when one divides up Numbers geographically, we find three clear sections. The first section takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai. That's Numbers 1 through Numbers 10, verse 11. It's the final encampment before the wilderness journey. Now, last week, I shared how everything slowed down at Sinai. Exodus 1 through 24 covers decades pretty rapidly. It is very fast-paced. But from Exodus 25 through Leviticus through Numbers 10, it all slows down and records about 1 month. The section in Numbers 1 through 10, mainly continues the themes from Leviticus. It's mostly about the priestly duties that were needed as Israel prepared to break camp. And the section ends with God leading them in the day by a cloud and at night by a pillar of fire, just as God did in Exodus. Now, here's an interesting tidbit. There are 139 chapters in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the 4 books of the Torah or the Pentateuch that have Moses as the central character. The setting of 60 of those 139 chapters are at the foot of Mount Sinai. 60 of the 139 chapters covers only 1 month. The slow pace theologically reveals the importance of the giving of the Torah and proper worship. I don't give that tidbit of info simply so that we can amaze our friends and loved ones with biblical trivia during breakfast tomorrow. There's a reason I've mentioned it, and I'll get back to it at the end. The next section of Numbers is the wilderness wanderings, and that goes from Numbers 10, verse 12 through Numbers 21, verse 9. Now, folks, this was supposed to be a brief trip. What could have been at most a few months' journey ends up taking 40 years. Because of a rebellion, which took place only 3 months after Sinai, God determined that the first generation of the Exodus would have to all die, and it would be the second generation who would enter the promised land. And it's in this section, this from Numbers 10 through Numbers 21, that the narrative pace picks back up. Everything speeds back up again, and these 11 chapters cover 40 years. So we go from this huge section that covers 1 month to the small section that speeds up and takes care of 40 years pretty quickly. And then the last section of Numbers can be classified as a section on the plains of Moab, and that's from Numbers 21, verse 10 through the end of the book in Numbers 36. And everything slows down again with this last section of Numbers. This last section of Numbers plus Deuteronomy covers the final year, the 40th year. And the plains of Moab are on the eastern side of the Jordan River as Israel makes its final preparations to finally enter Canaan, the promised land. Now, there are several great stories in Numbers. Lots of stories, and because there's so many good stories, it makes choosing tonight's pivotal passage a very hard one. And no matter what my or your pivotal passage may be, again, knowing where in the narrative the story takes place will help us in understanding it. So here we go with my pivotal passage. I'm choosing Numbers 13, verses 17 through the first part of verse 20. Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, "Go up there in the Negev and go up into the hill country and see what the land is like, and whether the people who live in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, and whether the land they live in is good or bad, and whether the towns that they live in are unwalled or fortified, and whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be bold and bring some of the fruit of the land." The context of that passage is that Moses decides to send 12 spies into Canaan. And the aftermath of the report from the spies ends up being the most serious of all rebellions in the wilderness. And it's the aftermath that's the reason that I chose Moses' command as the pivotal passage. 10 of the 12 spies come back. I mean, all of the spies come back, but 10 of the 12 of the spies report that the bounty of the promised land, but they become intimidated by the size of its inhabitants, stating that classic line, "We seem like grasshoppers compared to them." And only 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, recommended that Israel trust the Lord and proceed with the plans to enter Canaan, despite the size of its inhabitants. Now, the report of the 10 reaches the entire population, and there's a total freak out. the people of Israel end up saying it would have been better to die in Egypt than to die out here in the wilderness. And Joshua and Caleb try to reason with the crowd to have faith and trust in the Lord. Moses once again has to intervene with the Lord, but the end result is that from this rebellion, God determines that the Exodus generation would have to die off by wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. The promised land would have to wait until the second generation. Thus, the Hebrew title of the book is all about in the wilderness. Folks, the struggle is real. And maybe that is a huge takeaway from the entire book and part of its value to us. Eugene Peterson, in his introduction to the book of Numbers in the Message Bible, writes this: becoming a truly human community is a long, complex, messy business. The book of Numbers plunges us into the mess of growing up. The people who find themselves called and led and commanded by God find themselves in the company of men and women who sin a lot. You name it, we do it. We need help in getting along with each other. Wise discipline is required in becoming a people of God. This book is essential in training our imaginations to take in some of these less than romantic details by which we are formed into the people of God. I like that. Again, the struggle is real. It has been said that we never learn by seeing the light. We only learn by feeling the heat. And in the book of Numbers, we find story after story of different types of complaining and quarreling and rebellions. And Israel, like us, had to learn some hard lessons. But always, in the end, even with God's punishments, God's mercy and grace get the final word. Despite the struggles, despite the peaks and valleys of the journey, despite the constant one step forward and 3 steps backward, the book of Numbers is one that gave hope to Israel, especially later as they dealt with the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. By that time, the nation had been reduced to just 2 tribes, and they went by the name of Judah. Last week in our discussion time after the recording, there was a question about who and when the Pentateuch, that's the 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Torah, when the Pentateuch, when the Torah was written. And I explained that the scholarship believes that there were oral traditions and probably segments of it that had been written down, but the Torah and the Old Testament that we have today were compiled and formed during those years, during and after the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE. You see, Judah at that time faced a crisis. They had lost the promised land. They were in danger now of losing their identity. And they were wondering what happened to us. And then how do we get it back? How did we get off track? And how can we return? And is there any hope for us? And what happened then is what we continue to do today. We talk about the past to comment on the present. It's what I and every other preacher in the world does every Sunday. Remember when I mentioned how the narrative slowed down to emphasize the importance of receiving Torah and how to properly worship? Well, keeping Torah and worship would be what the prophets would judge Israel on, and they failed miserably. But Numbers and the rest of the Torah recalls the past to instruct the present of the exile. And the message is, you can get back to the promised land if you return to Torah keeping and worshiping as you ought. The exile was seen by Judah as a punishment from God. But the rabbis at the time also wanted Judah to remember that mercy and grace always had the last word, not only for their ancestors, but also for them. And to the members of the exile, reading Numbers gave them hope that God had not abandoned them. Pretty much everything in Numbers has some type of practical application, not only as it happened, not only to the Babylonian exiles, but also to us today. And now, as the book of Numbers ends, Israel finds itself on the opposite bank of the Jordan River, just outside the promised land. And their leader, Moses, has one more speech in him. Until next week, God's abundant grace and peace.